Awesome. So we are now live. So welcome to Off the Record, Airtable Secrets and Lore. This is week, I believe it's like 38, 39. We're a group of Airtable users exploring new ways to use Airtable to optimize our businesses and lives, open to hearing from anyone about your experience, good or bad, using Airtable to make a positive impact in the world. We attempt to promote people coming from any level to share your ideas or ask questions. We also share our experiences, tips, and practices and offer ways to get help and get involved in the community. We meet every Wednesday from 7 p.m. Eastern Time to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here in Zoom. So if you'd like to join and it's that time on a Wednesday, go to www.videowithben.com. We're here most Wednesdays. So to kick things off, I think the most relevant and most exciting piece of news that we got this week was like the custom views. Getting to see a little bit more info about that. I know Chris has been to a few of those meetings kind of with Airtable that they've put on. I don't know if anybody else got to see those, but that's kind of the really exciting stuff that I've only heard about. Is that
right?
accurate?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah,
well, Kamille was at one of my meetings.
So there were
at the other. Couldn't see.
There were three different places where it was sort of publicly mentioned. One was the Ask Me Anything that was today. Another was the Table Talk, which is their weekly show with Aaron, and the other was some other thing that I wasn't there for. So I was there for 2 out of 3.
Gotcha. And do you know like how it works, or did they say anything about it, or was it just like the name of it was mentioned?
The general notion is that at some point you would be able to build a custom sort of view. It's not in beta and it's not going to be in beta anytime soon, but that's what they're working towards.
Oh yeah, they even told us where you could actually see the code that it's working. But the first event this week was yesterday. And that was an event. And again, people had a meltdown on Facebook. Listen, if you're on Facebook and you hate Twitter, or you're on Twitter and you hate Facebook, or you're on TikTok and you don't understand Instagram, rethink your life. Like this idea of warring over where you spend your time is just ridiculous. But on Twitter yesterday, at least, or 2 days ago, they mentioned they were having an event called Creating Tools for Creators. And what was interesting about that was it was going to be 4 lightning talks and then a chat with the CTO of Airtable, which, you know, CTO of Airtable, it's kind of a big deal. I did some screenshots for people who couldn't be there because I thought it was really kind of interesting. This is only the second event I've seen them do where they kind of bring in folks from, oh, by the way, am I sharing my screen okay?
If you can zoom in a little bit more for those watching, it'd be easier.
Yeah.
See if I make it even bigger. All right, that's right. So you can see the slide screenshot I took here.
Good, that's good.
All right. So this was only the second event I've seen where they had one was a couple months ago. I remember we were talking with Devin about this and Rebecca, and on that one, they were talking about their growth team and how they kind of hack Airtable to basically A/B test all sorts of new features, which we've all experienced. I thought that was really interesting. They would be that transparent. A lot of the people who went to that were people in other tech companies. I almost felt like in some ways they were doing like a virtual job fair and just guising it under growth, because they were like just basically, Kuovonne or Kamille, were you at the growth event?
I was at that one.
Again, really interesting play. So I thought, okay, we'll see if this happens. Of course, Table Talk, I think, was the next kind of big thing we saw from them. Obviously, you know, them bringing our friend Aaron in and making him an official creator of some sort was a big deal. But then this is really interesting this week. So we had 2 things this week. The first thing was this Creating Tools for Creators, which again, they had 4 members of the staff. I got their names somewhere in my notes here. And they each were going to take on something different. The first lightning talk was building the escape hatch. This one was really interesting because they talked about how Airtable, the platform, was basically this escape hatch out to the entire world. which was a really interesting thing to hear kind of their analogy and how they thought about Airtable. The next one was actually, the next lightning talk was actually called Connecting Airtable to the World, which was interestingly enough. Then they had a whole really interesting kind of section on automations. That one was very interesting because you could see a lot more of the thinking, a lot of the stuff Kamille was talking about 2 weeks ago when she was talking about kind of the nonlinear ways of maybe doing automations in the future. Then they had something that I didn't find it really interesting, but there were a lot of good stats, which was automations reliability. So basically the stuff behind it. When we got into the first one, the escape hatch, it was by this guy named Billy Littlefield, who you can find on Twitter. He's locked though. But he had this great slide talking about how Airtable is this flexible tool for storing data. That's literally how they think of Airtable. But it has this super long tail of what people want to do with their data. So when you just think about the data of Airtable, like what is it that people want to do? They just want to put it someplace, or do they want to, again, assign it to the owner is different than building a chart. So I guess in all their research, building a chart was like the first thing everybody wants to do, all the way down to handle roommate rent.
They have
which
such happy charts.
Right?
Charts are
So, I mean, what it just,
And look
I mean,
at cat
just-
pictures.
right? Do they have cat pictures on here? I didn't even read all these.
It's
Third from last.
So again, super interesting. Then when they talked about the problem with their long tail was like all the things that work with Airtable out of the box versus like these are all the things we usually talk about: formulas, views, apps, automations. But then they talk about all the kind of cool stuff they want to be able to do with this long tail. And that's literally what they just casually mentioned: custom views. Now, what was interesting about this was based, especially if you came to both talks, because today's talk, they kind of unpacked this a little bit. And I'll throw it over to Kamille when we get into today's talk and how they talked about this. But they talked about kind of the evolution of the app space and, you know, developers. And, I made a, comment today, like, just acquire apps. Camille's like, you can acquire me even though you pay me. It was really cute. But they literally just said, we want to be able to use the same engine to build custom views. And they talked about the challenges. So again, while I think they didn't mean to kind of like let the cat out of the bag, they said some interesting things in my notes for today. I put down to where I think the cat's out of the bag. This is going to be coming even faster than we thought. They talked about what was coming next. So they said they have 35 published. I don't know what 3P apps are now. Kamille, do you know what that means? Could that mean like external apps?
probably third party.
Yeah,
Third party.
it's
Thank
third
you.
party.
200 custom block developers. So Kamille, you'd be one of those. Kuovonne, you're one of those. So what? We have 1% on the channel tonight. I mean, come on. We have 1% of all the developers in the show tonight, and 120 monthly script runs. Which again, how often do we get to see these numbers? So there's a lot of transparency here. Then I can't remember this guy's name. He was amazing. He talked about integrations with Airtable. And what was really great about this was he really went into some of the challenges with kind of integrations. They are really doubling down on sync. I just want you guys to know it. They're going hard at sync. They talked about what people want to do with sync. They threw some shade at Salesforce, which I thought was really interesting. We have all these talks about, are Salesforce going to like acquire them at some point? I don't know, but apparently they know enough to throw shade at one another. Really interesting. Then they talked about, go ahead.
In the early days of this, off the record, we had an enterprise client on here quite a few times in a row. And if I remember right, the biggest thing that they were asking for as an enterprise client was bi-directional sync with like other parties. So that makes sense why they're following sync, if that's what enterprise clients want.
And literally bi-directional sync, they said, is coming. I mean, they know, no maybe, no ifs, ands, so on the roadmap. Some of the problems with sync stuff, I mean, these two developers, Kuovonne and Kamille, probably know, but like, what do you do with out of sync things? And then they literally said the future of sync, which they talked about two-way sync is coming, but then they talked about some really interesting syncs. So emailing CSVs and doing some things that way, which I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. They're just playing real hard with there. The other thing is like they had a really fancy term for this, but multi-sync. So one table, different data sources. So back in the day, we'd call this ODBC. You don't know, ODBC connection to one data source to another. So like one field could.
They have you can have one table. I believe it's only Airtable. So you can have, you might be able to do calendars. I can't remember.
But you can have one table synced from up to 3 sources if you're on the pro plan and up to 20 sources if you're on the enterprise plan. So are they just expanding the number of sources that you can sync in, or is that
acted like this was kind of be coming after this? But the term he used, again, I was trying to type and take screenshots. I'm not.
Maybe
I only got two hands and I'm old.
Bi-directional.
I was like, okay.
Bi-directional syncing would mean two-way syncing, if
Yes,
I'm not mistaken,
two-way.
meaning you can make an edit in a synced table and it would go back into the original, which is not something that you can currently do. Multi-source syncing is a thing that's already there.
Maybe bi-directional multi-source syncing. Throw all the words in one.
Well,
there was in the multi-source was he had a different term. I couldn't write it down fast enough. Bi-directional, he used 2 use cases. The first one was basically moving something on a Google Drive, and the other case was calendar, which of course everybody would probably love to. Again, calendar as an interface, and they said a lot of interesting things about calendar, by the way. When they got to the automations lightning talk, I thought you guys would think this was really interesting. They don't refer internally as automations. They refer internally as a programming environment. So they're talking about how automations are basically becoming the programming of Airtable. And they had this really great example of making an appointment with a hairstylist, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then they really doubled down on making an accessible programming environment. And they talked about just the natural language of things. So, how all in the UI, it says things like every 3 days instead of like some cryptic version of saying that. They really take a lot of, I guess, time to make sure that does that. This was the automation platform section. So basically making sure the automations run. They said a lot of things about reliability, how automations, most people don't see them, don't think about them, don't want to think about them. And then this guy, I can't remember his name. Does anyone know the CTO's name? He's on Twitter.
He came from Facebook Messenger.
Yeah, so he led Facebook Messenger, which I thought was, that's interesting, right? So based on scaling Facebook Messenger, people asked him why, what Airtable's like and why, and he just basically said, the same type of like large scale kind of job as Facebook Messenger with billions of users, except, with the number of records. They asked him how and why he joined Airtable. He talked a lot about, you can see some of the questions over here that he answered. I asked a question, I was the first thing he answered. So I said, what's the one thing you want to see in Airtable that you don't see today out of the box? I was blown away. He said the first thing was a family system. So a system to actually manage his family, which I thought, okay, so I sent him a link to my base. And then the second thing was more, of course, he had to say more enterprise software creation. And that was it. Thoughts from the panel?
Well, the one dude before the CTO was quite the joy to listen to.
He was not. I mean, yeah. I mean, he was. He was just pro tip for all you community and product people out there. Try to find interesting people to put on camera. I know it's sometimes hard, but like even if you don't have an interesting person, take someone who's actually interesting and have the person who doesn't like to be on camera explain it to them. We need it. So, but what do you guys think? I think this was a big deal. This putting the CTO live online, letting him answer questions and like exposing some of the back end stuff. What are your thoughts? I mean, I've never seen this level of transparency as an average outsider. Kamille and Kuovonne are in communities I'm not.
I think that Airtable is definitely producing a lot more media and content of reaching out and saying, here's who we are. I still get the feeling that they're just throwing a lot out there and seeing what sticks. So I'm wondering, how many, there's just so many new things coming out. How many of them are actually going to still be around 6 months from now? In the meantime, any information we can get, I think is great. On the automations, one thing that I've noticed is that everything has an ID, an internal ID in Airtable. So like internally tables, they're TBL with a 14-letter alphanumeric code. Records are REC with verticals. Automations, I noticed that they're FL. Is it FLD? FLD. So where I was thinking, it's like, to me, it was like, okay, they're already thinking of these as workflows or something like that, where that's what they're doing. And when I first saw the expanded view, I thought that looks a lot like what Integromat does. And I've long said that you are writing code, even if you're not typing it. As soon as you want to have something more complicated with some kind of branching logic or any types of loops, that's code. People might call it no code because it doesn't look like code, but it is code.
Yeah, well, I've long maintained any manual is code. How to cross stitch is code. We've got this kind of fetish with coding and math that we have to shake. Kuovonne, I really would love for you to unpack what you said about you think they're throwing a lot against the wall and see what it sticks. Because I heard some things today that I think could interest. Did you go to today, Kuovonne?
So I went to today's, but I was like in the car driving and couldn't pay that much attention to it. But no, I mean, I think there's a lot that they're developing underneath the scenes that they're not telling us. And several months ago, they said, hey, there are lots of neat, interesting things coming out. And we're like, okay, well, we'll see it when it shows up. Now we're starting to see some of those, but all of this extra, they're having the table talk, they're having the ask me anything and these other things. It's all of these different ways of interacting with the community that I see them doing. And I'm wondering how much of that is going to stick.
Okay. Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, they went from like nothing, like the Kremlin, to like, Radio Free Europe.
To ask me anything.
Like, really? I mean, I was like, really? Like, how is all this happening right now? And like, okay, yeah, I think you're right. I don't know if all these things will make it. I don't think the numbers on today's event were large. Kamille, what do you think today's numbers were?
Not a clue.
Because like in the question, the Q&A portal, I just saw you and I.
I saw a couple of people asking and answering questions.
Okay.
One of the questions that I found interesting was someone asked, how come I'm just now hearing about, I've just found out about this like 5 minutes before it started. How come paying customers have to, hunt down this information? And then the answer was, it was on the newsletter and it was on Twitter and it was on the Airtable community forums. And it, aside from emailing everyone who currently has an Airtable account, they did publicize the Ask Me Anything, and the table talks are talked about on the community forums. The other one that I didn't attend, I didn't see much broadcast of that one. The one that you were just showing screenshots for.
Yeah, the Tuesday one. I think that was ours. That was already so broadcast, and I remember thinking, I really wish I could go to that one because I found the previous one interesting. It just ended up being at a bad time, and then it wasn't. I think right now what they're really focusing on telling everyone right now is Airtable is going to be out on Friday. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of that, and they don't want to overload people with other information because that's such a huge, important information right now.
Yeah, Kamille, I did not see somebody say that, but that's interesting because someone on the Facebook group kind of was like, where is this? And I'm like, Twitter, like.
But I'm not sure.
I would hate to see, let me just say this. I would hate to see their community manager, whose name I'll mention in a moment. I would hate to see their community manager feel like she wasn't successful because somebody got angry in an enterprise because they are not on Twitter. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's like, this was a good event. They need more of these. Today's event.
As far as the size, what tells me more, the fact that you didn't see other people asking stuff. Like, I asked some stuff, but I don't think anyone actually got to see it in chat or the Q&A, everything like that. But the fact that they ran out of people who had put their hands up that they wanted to talk. If it would have been a much larger audience, I imagine that there would have been more people who would have had something they actually wanted to ask, not just in the Q&A.
I mean, if you look at their interactions, you've got table talk where you're allowed to like text chat with Aaron, and then you had this one where you could submit questions ahead of time or type questions in the QA or go live at the end. To me, out of those things, like, I want to see more people doing live. You know what I mean? Like, just not this, you have a chance to prepare your answer, just live.
The other thing that I'm seeing, though, is it's a lot of the same names and the same faces in a lot of these things. So, you look in there and you're like, oh, there's Chris again, there's Kamille again, and it's great, but
I don't have a job. And Kamille has 7. So somewhere between not working and 100 jobs, you've got, apparently no one has time to go. You have to be unemployed or overemployed, and then you can go to these things.
But I guess the one thing that I would really like to see from Airtable is having something that's separated out. Like the table talks I find are great for people who are new to Airtable, who are wanting to see demos of certain features, but they're not as useful for someone who's already knows Airtable in depth and really wants to get into the nitty gritty of some of these things. And I'm like, okay, can we get something that's not just for newbies and novices? Can we get something where people already know all of that stuff and they really want to find out more in depth and little edge cases of how things are handled?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that they have to do that. The other thing is, I agree, you do see kind of the same faces over and over again, but so many corporate people who are using Airtable probably don't think about Airtable as something that's career defining, like our consultants or our power users or our developers like you two. So I just, as someone who comes from like corporate software, enterprise IT software, I just don't think their community outreach is going to be as successful as it would until they, I hate to say it, lower their site. So more of like the independent makers and the what could you do for your hometown or your church, those types of things. Enterprise is going to sort itself out. I know they have to focus on it, but they've got to stop this like relentless push that we're as good as Slack. No, you're better. Nobody wants another Slack channel. Everybody wants another Airtable feature. Oh, I got some screenshots from today. Kamille probably can help me with today because she was there. So today's event was the community AMA. Am I sharing this okay? I can try to make it bigger, but I think I'm at my absolute biggest with this thing. I think it's actually getting smaller. Is it big or big enough?
Yeah.
You got a beautiful view of Jordan's profile.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Jordan was amazing, by the way. So this was their first community AMA, which I thought that's interesting. I personally was wondering, why didn't they just host this on their YouTube as a live thing? Like, you know, build the community around that, but it was fine. I was on a Zoom. What I thought was interesting about Taylor and Jordan. So Jordan's the head of community. Taylor is in product. I don't know if he's the product manager, but I'm going to go to Kamille now. Kamille seems to know who Taylor is because she was #Team Taylor.
Yeah, the first thing I said in the chat was "Good morning," #Team Taylor. As a developer for custom apps, usually Taylor is involved in some process of me submitting an app for review, and so I've had the opportunity to just email him back and forth, and I found him to be remarkably helpful and just knowledgeable about what the general direction is from a developer platform side of things. So not the entirety overarching, you know, what's Airtable got in their back pocket, but for the stuff that it's directly relevant to me, I happen to know a little bit more about Taylor's involvement just because I develop apps for the marketplace. And so he was.
Did you ever talk to him? Like actually talk to him like on the phone or something,
yes.
Or just email some things? Okay.
Yeah. And so he's on this one because as part of his team, they were migrating timeline from an app into a view, which was the focus of the Ask Me Anything for today.
And I'll be honest, guys, the Ask Me Anything I thought was exceptional. I'm just gonna say exceptional. They pulled back the curtain so much on this. So one of the first things they said that I thought was really interesting was they have a use cases team. Now, Kamille, were you on the call when they kind of opened up with this? It's a use cases team and unpacked that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So last week's table talk with Aaron also had Taylor as a guest, and he also mentioned it there. And I remember Rebecca was in the chat and she was like, hold on, there's a use cases team? What does that mean? And so the answer was, it's a sort of nebulous sort of group, if that makes sense. Or at least that's my understanding in their sort of the people who just work in and around Airtable on the product design side. And what their function appears to be is just to look at either incoming help requests or just directly asking some of their customers, what do you use Airtable for, or what do you use this particular feature for, or series of features for, and where is it failing? And so it was brought back into the context of the current AMA, where people had so many different requests of the Gantt view, which also used to be an app, that they started to look at it and saying, well, it doesn't make sense to add these features to Gantt because that's not what Gantt was made to do. But timeline is awful close. So, they took a lot of the feedback that they had heard and moved it towards timeline.
Yep. And again, amazing that they have kind of the forethought that. When they were talking about the use cases team, again, they didn't say the long tail this time. They said they kept referring to it as horizontal, how horizontal Airtable was, which again, you have to look at the language they're using internally as it seeps out externally, because it tells you a lot about how they're thinking about the long term. And we've talked about portals, we've talked about front ends, we've talked about actual apps, and we talked about all the things on the show. But I think this long tail and horizontal play they keep talking about is super interesting. Something else that blew my mind, they had been working on timeline for a year, but they built it quickly. Now, he didn't say how quickly, but he made it sound like weeks. So this tells you a lot about what we can expect in the future for more apps. And I think it tells us a lot if you unpack this. So let's just say it was 9 months of you researching it and product specifications for any of you who've done product management work. And then a month to build it and maybe beta test it. That's incredible, right? Are we looking at?
It sounds about right. And for a little bit of extra context, Taylor also mentioned the timeline view is still made out of the same building blocks as apps. So it's not, they converted into whatever series of code they use for all of the other views. It is still using the code base from the Airtable app development sort of SDK that they've made available. So that is probably why the built it quickly thing is the case, because it was already an app and it's built out of the code that makes apps. They just improved upon it and then slid it over, essentially. There's more stuff behind the scenes, but that, he did mention it's built out of the same stuff.
Interesting segue, because he did go on then to say that the only time-based way to view records, and they kept talking about design your data, was calendar and Gantt historically, which I thought, okay, he's right. There's an only two way. And Kamille, I kept looking for what you said last week about any app that has functionally touches records or single table. Remember that was your thesis? I think it was Kamille. I don't know, maybe it was Kuovonne. That's how they've been picking.
Kamille.
Okay. But then he went on, he said Gantt was originally built to test blocks. So when they started, I guess, the blocks and the apps and all that other kind of stuff, Gantt was kind of their first internal big thing. But then he said something really interesting, and he walked it back at the end of the show. He said, we decided to make timeline a first-class view type. Now, I'm just going to stop here, because this, to me, was the golden ticket to the chocolate factory. The fact that they consider views first class. Because everything we want out of a portal, everything we want out of what I would call a better front end is what they consider views. And it got me thinking, are we looking at a future where whatever engine that makes blocks and apps ends up being the front end?
Probably, and that's more or less what they've said over the 3 different sort of public webinars that we've sort of been dancing around. And for just a refresher, Airtable started off with views, and then blocks didn't exist when Airtable was first launched. That was a thing that was added, and then blocks were renamed to apps. And then now we're hearing that they want to make custom views a thing, much like custom apps are a thing. So it sounds like they're not quite going back to basics, but they're, realizing that the separation between an app and a view doesn't always make sense. Some of them make sense, like dedupe should not be a view. That doesn't make any sense at all. But to Kuovonne's point from the table talk, matrix does. Matrix could be a view, no problem. So I think it's they've sort of branched into one direction when they made the block/app thing. And then now they're sort of swinging the pendulum back to bring it back into the core of Airtable.
There's a couple other things that was occurring to me as you were talking about. This was one was I was thinking, it's actually been about a year since Taylor started on as a product manager. I actually went back to the community forums and looked at it, and it was about August of 2020 when he made his introduction on the community forums and saying, hey, I'm a new product manager. And he demoed a little app that he had written using the custom apps SDK. And
what was it, by the way? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but it was like one of these small proof of concepts. Like, and he got like horribly roasted because everyone was jumping and saying, wait a minute, why is Airtable coming out with this when there's all these other things that customers actually want? And that wasn't actually the purpose of the app. So I'm really glad that he bore with us and still plugged ahead because they've come out with really new things. But if you're saying that it took a year, well, he's been with this position for just about a year. So this has probably consumed most of his time when he has been the product manager for that. And the other thing is the idea of it taking a long time to research it, to get the look and the feel right, to make sure you're tackling all of the edge cases that you need to, that it's easy to use and still functional. I'm not at all surprised that that's the vast majority of the time that it takes. Once you actually know how you want everything to behave, the code goes very swiftly after that. It's trying to figure out, wait a minute, what should this look like? You build it and then you're like, oh, you try it out. It's like, no, that's not going to work at all. That takes a really long time.
Once you add it to the core product, there's in some ways no going back. If it's an app, you can change it. But if it's part of everybody's user interface and you get it wrong, then how do you fix that? People are going to complain.
Yep.
And then the other thing that I think is interesting, and I kind of asked this in the AMA, was if there's going to be any plans to separate out querying, deciding what records you're going to work with in what order, from the view itself. Because right now, views and queries are so tied in with each other that they're originally just the exact same thing, and that was the only way you could do it, was you had to have a view if you wanted to have a query that would filter and sort your records. Now you kind of have a way of querying when you're doing things in automations, because you can set up your filters that way with different conditions. But really, to me, views should be about what you see, what your eyes are seeing, and queries are something that's actually can be completely unrelated, because the query says, these are the records that I want to deal with. And maybe you want to have a query that returns specific results that you never actually have to see because it's there to run an automation or because it's there to drive some kind of API thing going on. And I think if they could separate those out a little bit, then maybe we could have something like, everyone wants the me view. Everyone wants a view that shows them what are my records that are important to me. But you can't do that right now because it's tied in with the data of the view, and that means it has to be the same for everybody.
How we used to do it was we'd have personal queries, or we call them groups, views. We'd have team, and then we'd have global. That's the reason all my base stuff always has a global thing. And I think the permission models that we're going to start to have to see filter through across Airtable is going to have to follow that type of methodology.
No. The problem with that is what happens when you've got a team of 50, 100 people that are all trying to get in this space? Do you want to have 50 different personal views there?
This is a reminder to myself that the app that I keep forgetting to release is My Records. So coming soon, folks.
I don't know. Again, I've seen this done 30 years ago, so I don't think it's hard. I just don't know what's taking them so long. So like Kamille said, it was built originally to test blocks. They said if you reveal code in Chrome and look at timeline, you'll actually see it's basically, like you said earlier, it's just blocks, which again was super good. They had a great little example of kind of the biggest difference, and it was this idea of being able to separate any kind of the views. He went deep into what Kamille showed us, which I think blew my mind, which was the labeling function. They talked a lot about how the labeling function was a big deal. I specifically asked about what I call card view. You know how when you click in timeline, you get a miniature before an expanded view. Interestingly, they said they're looking at putting that in more parts of the product.
Well, it's already in calendar. It's just limited because you can't add new things to the card. It technically was already there. It's just better in timeline.
Yeah, timeline is just so tight with it. I completely agree with you. It's just like when I saw timeline, it just really kind of made my day. So there was that.
The other thing I thought was interesting was he mentioned when it came to doing the row height, how that was kind of a Hail Mary that they put in at the very end. I'm like,
yeah.
That surprised me because adjustable row height, that's actually something that's really important to users that I think that a lot of new users, they're like, wait a minute, I can't auto adjust my row height. And they want to see more of that. So I'm surprised that it hasn't gotten more.
My understanding of that was not the expandable row height, because that's been there for over a year. It's the switching the orientation of labels within that same drop-down menu.
Oh, okay.
That's how I understood because he was talking about timeline, and expanding row height is any view that you can do that in. It's grid and it's timeline, and I think one other. I think he was talking about.
Oh, okay. The making it physical. Yeah.
Which does seem like we can add it.
Yeah.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, and that's kind of the next thing. So the next thing we got into was like, well, what's the future of all this? And when asked about the future, he said, literally, we have a lot of work happening right now. It's basically becoming a user interface when talking about views. So again, the whole idea of back to custom views, which then you could tell he was like kind of talking about this. Maybe it was weird because he acted like he shouldn't. And if he talked about it with Aaron, I don't know why maybe he was just being coy to be cute. I thought that was really interesting. Then we got into long time ranges. Somebody, I think it was Kamille, asked about millennia. I know I want it because I have a lifetime's worth of data. So like I would love at least a decade view. He said not on the roadmap. Oh, was it Kuovonne?
I think.
Yeah,
BCE.
Yeah, so I asked if you could get something longer than the 5 years, if you could get like decades, and then if you could get BCE tapes, which is people have been asking for a long time. I actually didn't like his answer because his answer was that it would just get too crowded with all of those records. So I'm like, but the time frame that you have in your scale, that's determined by the time frame that you have, and you could have any number of records in there. I mean, you could have 10,000 records that are all on the same day. So, or you can have where you show, 500 years, but your base only happens to have 80 records in it. So I kind of didn't like that answer. But I can see how they needed to focus on what do they think would be something really valuable to bring to most people right now. And that was it.
Yeah. I don't think I cannot imagine there's that many people who need to look at things in the BC.
I mean, I have a base
I don't think there's that many people that need that, the older timers, but this is what I see is I really want databases to be brought to education, to lower levels of education, to high school students, and even younger than that. I think it has to be high school students just because you have to be at least 13 to get your own account. But there's every history class, you have to build timelines. Get these kids, when they're still students, hooked on using Airtable and thinking in a database point of view.
Okay, so moving on from that.
He also talked about
Kuovonne needs her whole educational show apparently. So let's just put it on the docket, Ben. Kamille.
I was going to say the time view in the other direction within a single day,
and that's exactly where I was going next. Mm-hmm. So again, when we asked about smaller time, hourly or daily, he talked about that, and that's to your point when both of you guys, they kind of picture something when you're doing smaller, looking more vertical, like a schedule or what Google Calendar calls agenda view, which again, I think that'll be an interesting play if they end up doing that. Current roadmap for timeline and just this whole idea is just making things more useful. So right now they're working on timeline, making it super functional. So calculating things. We talked about resource allocation being a big thing. He said one of the biggest challenges with custom views right now is they make sure they don't want to clutter up views. And again, that got me thinking, are we now looking at an app store plus a view app store? there's one of the things we talked about in the show a few weeks ago was you're going to have whole Airtable experience people, I think soon. You'll have developers, I kind of seeing this whole thing starting to blow up now. And then last but not least, their idea was they wanted to bring blocks. I talked about this, the mini view to other parts and just roll out. Oh, and the last thing he said was really interesting. He says right now they're just rolling out features and iterating. And that's something they're going to continue to try to do, which I don't know. That to me was another big tell. The era of waiting for like big things to happen and drop is over. It sounds like it's going to be this way from now on. New thing, new thing, new thing. Not like weeks where some people have one thing and nobody else does. And it's how'd you get that? And like one big release. It sounds like it's mini kind of features. So all in all, an amazing couple of days of Airtable behind the curtain.
So I actually kind of like that idea of, like, one of the things that I thought was brilliant about Airtable when I first realized it is that they don't have a self-hosted version. That means that empowers them to make the changes, roll out changes when they want, roll out iterative changes. And at first I thought not having a self-hosted version was like, well, why wouldn't you do that? So many people want that. But I can see how it really empowers them to make development like this without having big releases. Because one of the problems with big releases is if you have a problem with one thing, that can hold up the entire release. So this is, you get something, you show that it works, you roll it out independent of other things.
Well, Chuck probably knows. Chuck, you've been in enterprise IT, right?
Yep.
I mean, back in the day, we had this concept, I don't even know if this is still a phrase that the kids use anymore, called on-prem. So basically you had your SaaS-based software, but then some companies just demanded on-prem, which was a localized version. And I don't even know if Airtable offers a localized version. One of the reasons they had to used to have to do this is for different financial laws in different countries. Now I'm going back to like 2005 to 2010 when like SaaS was still kind of new. Chuck, do you remember these days?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. It's like, it doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it's 15 years is a long time. And it really make me think, Kuovonne, do they have a local version of Airtable? Does anyone have any idea?
When you say a local version, you're on premises, that's what I meant by a self-hosted is.
Yeah. Do they have
it doesn't
one?
exist. You can't, if you want Airtable, it has to be run on Airtable servers. You can't say, okay, I want this, but I want it on my own servers. You can't do that.
It's interesting. Salesforce and ServiceNow both used to, I don't know if they've switched, allow on-prem or self-hosted.
Airtable does not.
Interesting.
Oracle is going the same way. Everything's in the cloud. They still, I mean, everybody still touts the hybrid version, on-prem plus cloud, but I don't really see, other than the possibility of getting rid of iCloud, cloud latency, I don't really see any super benefit to on-prem unless they unlocked server-side customizations. And I think that would be a tough support issue, don't you?
Well, I was just keynoted at a Microsoft event in September, and one of the things they have done in the past 5 years is this whole zero, I can't remember, I'm sorry if there's an InfoSec person in the audience, but it's a whole zero trust model. So basically getting rid of VPNs, everything is secure on either side. It's just like everything that used to make remote work like a nightmare, they've been working on getting rid of, which makes me wonder, like, will we ever even have an on-prem? Again, historically, when we used to sell on-prem or hybrid solutions, it was for one of two reasons, like legality and certain type of sensitive data, financial data used to be, health data had to be this way. And the second reason was some countries don't care. Like if you want to sell software in Europe, you need to have European servers. Yes, it's on the Airtable servers, but they better be in Europe. Right. So I don't know where we're at with all that. I've been out of the business for so long.
I don't see anything where Airtable would guarantee, locality of your data to, just like you said, hey, if you want to do business in Europe, your server's got to be in Europe. They get really antsy about, having a server in Fairfax, Virginia for Germany. But I have never seen anything from Airtable's side that addresses that in any way.
I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a bigger question, not part of this show's audience, but would they do that?
I've seen questions come up like that a few times in like the past 2 weeks about if you can pick where your data is hosted. I can't remember the answer.
I think there's a lot of enterprise users who don't really care where Airtable is. They want their own solutions so that they can, and this is a perennial goal, to get things done more quickly than IT. In my last engagement for a major defense contractor, we were modernizing their equipment. And let's just say that the hardware and software were entering end of life in 18 months. And they hadn't had any changes for years and years. And so they sidestepped, and they used at the time, because Airtable was just on the horizon, they went ahead and did a shared access database from Microsoft because they could write their own stuff. And I'd always wished for something like Airtable so I'd never have to touch access again. I'm betting that there's a lot of enterprises that say, gee, we need this feature. And if you give it to us, or if we just take it on our own and we develop it, because there's no code here, right? IT, just let us play here. And we can add some features that we couldn't get in your normal delivery timeline.
Well, Chuck, you bring up something so important. So again, if I go back to the 90s and the early 2000s of my career, the big thing then was, are you allowed to have your own laptop or your own machine, right? Could I even have my own keyboard? Then by like 2007, 2008, could I have my own phone, right? And then I could never have my own apps. And I think what we're seeing here is kind of the dawn of, not only shadow IT, but like the book of shadows IT, because your ability to now, not only, because like I'm someone, if you've read my book, you know that like since 1995, I've been forwarding my own enterprise email to a separate server like Hillary Clinton and saving it, because your worth is tied up in everything you're giving away for that paycheck. And I just, I'll die on this hill. Do not get paid from wherever you want, but save your work because you'll use it again. No one will care. Airtable takes that concept and anything you build and allows you to leave that company and walk out with it. And I don't know if there's anything stopping someone from sharing a base with themselves off of that organization and just copying it and saying, okay, I've left the company. I've got something I built. Here I am at this new company now. Is there anything stopping them?
Nothing. You can just duplicate it. You can just copy everything, even if someone else built it. Even if the only thing you can do is look at it.
Yeah.
Which, again, I don't see Airtable addressing that. And I don't want them to address this, right? Because I think, again, the toothpaste is out of the tube. But like, I don't see anyone even talking about the absolute nightmare in security and intellectual property and everything that Airtable actually is behind the scenes. By the way, and I'm all for it. I'm here for it, right? Because I burn the companies to the ground, right? I'm not a big one, but I'm surprised.
I've got two accounts, one personal and one for the organization that I'm volunteering at. And you can just move. You can just, from one account say, hey, this guy has access. And you just duplicate it to your personal account. And you're right. It would be any enterprise chief security officer's nightmare.
So I think the security issue is something that Airtable is very, very aware of, and that it's something that it just requires so much changes to their code base that it's not something that they can roll out quickly. And so that they're taking the approach that it's better not to talk about it until they can have something that is more robust. They are gradually doing things like they added it so that enterprise users can say, hey, you can't share it. They can lock it down so you can't share to other people. So that's, one step in the right direction.
I just had three big.
That won't stop duplicating.
Each one of them, I built an Airtable solution for, and then with each one of them, the head of the project who hired me to speak, but also paid me to do media and code on low code, said to me, "We cannot let our IT department know about this, but build it. We'll embed it on our portal. No one will know what it's running on." And I mean, these are like billion-dollar companies. And I was just like, in the back of my mind, I'm going, okay, I know I'm not 35 anymore working at a company, but this is illegal as shit. Like this is the big leagues, right? And I
Absolutely.
thought no code is so much bigger than no code.
It's every C-sex nightmare.
Yeah. I don't know if this is our audience's kind of focus, so maybe we should get back to funness.
Well, what I see is Airtable has said earlier is they want to democratize software creation. They want to make it easy for people who don't think of themselves as developers to develop. And I think they do a great job of that. I'd like to see even more of that. Like, okay, you mentioned Access. There's a reason why Access is the most hated database on the planet. It's because it was one of the most used, that you had a bunch of amateurs who had no clue what they were doing, could build amazing, useful things that worked, 93% of the time. And that's what up there. And it's because it was just so darn useful and easy to build your whole user interface that would do what you wanted, that had the little bit of macros. So they had macros. If you didn't know how to write code, you could record a macro, and then the macro would go do what you wanted. And it was like a version of like Code Light without actually writing code.
Right.
I don't see Airtable doesn't have that in between just yet. And I think that's one of the next things that they need to do, is because writing custom apps it's a dream if you know how to code. If you don't know a little bit of how to code. I think there are so many people who had never used Airtable before, never used React before, and in the space of a couple of months were able to come out with apps. But it's still too high for most people. So there's got to be something in between, that's some kind of a custom front end developer that is easier than what's out there, that will be just as easy as it was for Microsoft Access.
That's very true. The formula the formulas you can put in a base without any scripting are pretty rudimentary, and it's just such a huge step from that to scripting. We have this thing called JavaScript. Let's tell you about it. Oh, and by the way, unless you move off our platform, that scripting is going to be, you can't use any of the JavaScript tools. So what can you use, and how can you use it? And it's a big step. You're right. Do you foresee them enhancing their current pretty primitive formulas, or what would you like to see them do there?
So, I actually think I actually like their formula system. I think there's more formulas that they could add. Please give us a number format. I'm actually on the no, don't give us a split, even though there are lots of people that want to split. But I see there's a nice progression between writing formulas to writing scripts to writing custom apps. And it's steps. I don't want that to be steps, though. I want it to be like just a gentle slope to make it a little bit easier, rather than here's the step. And then for writing formulas is like this high. And then writing scripts is like this. And then writing custom apps is like this. It's like, can we bring that slope down and make it easier?
I think to a certain extent, that's what Bi-Directional is for, the interface sort of company that they acquired. So it would be like a drag and drop interface, sort of like Retool. But there comes a point where you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
At some point, not everyone is going to know precisely what they want, A, in the first place, and B, even if they had a drag and drop system, not everything can be drag and droppable. At some point, you need somebody who knows how to code. So I agree.
You need to know someone who knows how to code. You don't necessarily need to have someone who knows how to type JavaScript. You need to have someone who can look through and says, okay, we need to have a button, and the button needs to do steps A, B, and C. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to write traditional code to do that. I mean, I said in Access, you could do that with macros.
It does mean that you either have to build a macro system, or you build a very complicated action system like Bubble
like
has,
what they have.
Or
their automations are really darn close.
It's not close enough to replace what custom apps is doing.
Not to replace it, but as far as having a way of getting something similar to a macro system.
I can kind of see that. I think what is missing is there's pieces that I think are somewhere in Airtable's sort of existing framework that would need to be either moved or made more universal. So one example is the button field type, where you can assign it some sort of action. It takes you to a URL, it opens a particular script, it does some other third thing. What I mean making something more universal is we keep talking about how they eventually want to make it so you could build your own view. If you notice in the top view or the top sort of panel of any view type where it has the filter and the sort and all those other options, how there's a lot of room on the right-hand side of the screen, it's just white space. It is possible where someone could put a button there. And then to Kuovonne's point, perhaps that button would be some sort of macro. I don't know what you would do with that per se, but I think it would
Just a button in the expanded view. But I think you guys told me you already have that, right?
And I'm talking about, let me see if I could share my screen really quickly.
I would love to be able to hide different fields in a expanded view than in like the grid view.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I keep coming back to this. This is basically what I call form view, even though they call it
they want that menu.
Yeah.
And
make them.
I think what people like is if they have the ease of building things out in an automation, and they could turn that into something that they could run from a button field on their computer that would run locally without taking up automation runs. But that was as easy to build as an automation because they wouldn't have to write code. That would be really nice.
What I was referring to is all this sort of dead air in this white bar. So not tied to a particular record. You would create a new action. We'll call it action instead of automation. And a button would go here and you would assign it some sort of either some sort of macro or some sort of whatever the quote unquote final form of the automation builder ends up being, or some other similar sort of system. Perhaps that could go there.
Now give me a second toolbar that I can fill with as many buttons that I want that would run at the view level.
I think that would get too
cluttered. But and I'll tell you how we used to use this. It was so interesting because what we would do is we would have like an expanded, can you give me an expanded form button? Or expanded form, yeah. What we would do with one of these, what we would do here is we would literally have all the fields that we wouldn't want anyone to really play with would be read-only. And then we'd have a button that would write to the read-only, kind of like you can now when you do an automation. And that button would then update it. So if you wanted to say, I accept this assignment, like right now, if someone says, when you assign someone something, it's not very complicated. It would put the current date and current time in there. And then you could start to kind of have those. And this is like, again, I hate the fact we spent so much time talking about Microsoft Access, but like,
you can say you're not allowed to press this button until everything's filled out and valid.
Yes, yeah. And when you could hit it, but it wouldn't do anything. And you used to be able to design the modal that you would get, like the warning label you would get. Like, okay, you didn't fill out this yet, and it just. I know we're going to get there, but I think if people love Airtable now, wait till you see what Airtable looks like when it functions like it's in 1990. You will love it 100 times more.
I can really see a function that could be called with the button, and the result would pop into a read-only field, just like you said.
Yep. Yeah. I'm telling you, the stuff I'm going to build when this thing becomes 1990 ready, jaw-dropping.
It's heaven to all the people who were developing with Access, though. This thing is fantastic. You can run it on the web, and that we started to do a volunteer development base that you had to be inside the station's network to use, of course, because we're not going to share an access base on the web. And once I found about Airtable, I gladly threw the thing away.
It's crazy because like Kamille, Kuovonne talked about low code, right? Chuck, you've got 2 accounts. I recently started helping a young man who lives in New York. He has a startup. he's opening up kind of these businesses that are crossed between Chuck E. Cheese and Meow Wolf. If you guys know Meow Wolf, these art installations. So kind of, it sounds cool. Long story short, he reached out to me, booked 10 minutes with me. I charged, Ben knows this, I'm not charging $50 for 10 minutes. And people are signing up. Like, once you put a price on your time, people are like, I'll buy that. I was like, oh, all I do is put it. But I spent a couple hours with this guy just doing some ad hoc Airtable stuff. This guy knew nothing about even spreadsheets, right? Just basically big picture guy, well-funded. In 2 hours, he's built a system now for the business and for his personal life, use external views that link the two, and now has like one other space where it's kind of all filtered for him. And like the power with, if you could get someone with the right mindset, with a right view, don't go down to the weeds, don't show them. I didn't go into automations. In fact, I would let them touch them. Right? I would let them touch apps. Like, just think about what you want, right? It's amazing what people are going to be able to do, I think, in the future with this. And, you know, we really need to look at, like, as a community, are we really focusing on, I'm going to go all the way back to something Kuovonne was talking about, helping people? Because I do believe there should be kind of a lower bar to get involved with Airtable. Right now, to me, Airtable still feels too, if I look at it externally, not like you guys and not like the Facebook group, but just externally, it still feels too bro-ish.
What-ish?
Bro-ish, like, you know, like tech bro. It still doesn't feel accessible. And I don't know what it's going to take for it to feel more accessible to me.
I do feel that it goes a long way beyond what a lot of similar tools, particularly enterprise tools, do. Mm-hmm. You can use their help system. I mean, when's the last time you had a problem with Excel or Word and you actually went out to Microsoft to find out? Google is your friend there. And there are really nice tutorials and videos that Airtable has that, you know, in our own help system, we just point them to it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is that people think that Airtable, or they get confused with how Airtable works, is because they're not used to thinking in the way a database works. They're coming from their spreadsheet and they're like, why can't I do this thing that is so easy in my spreadsheet? And I know I'm a broken record, but it's when people learn to think that way, then it will be more approachable. It will be easier because they will already understand what is a record and why a record doesn't have a fixed place. So in some ways, I think it's going to take a generation to get that when you have those people. I mean, before, people were like, what's a word processor? How do you do that? Well, and now you don't think about that at all. You just type and you see another word processor, and you know how it used, and you expect certain features. But it takes that shift in mindset of people thinking how they think about going about creating and processing their data.
That's a really good point. If the user has the proper background, I introduced Airtable today to our development manager. She's used to a CRM, and she saw the similarities in to a spreadsheet right away. She cottoned right on to the fact that, oh, if you want to see the skills a volunteer has, you can click here in the volunteer table. But if you go up to the skill table, you'll see a similar view of all the volunteers with that skill. She instantly got it. But, you know, if the guy is the big picture guy, you know, like what Chris was saying, how do you get that guy into the idea of database?
For me, I'll be honest with you, I put him in Miro and I said, draw your life in business. You know, 15 minutes later, he handed me a picture. I said, okay, now I'm going to translate this. And again, I had that one little chart I created a long time ago that says it's basically an automated car and a bunch of car parts and 2 steps in the middle. And I said, now an automated car is this in Airtable, a record is this, you know. And I don't know what it is, but I think we need to have simpler ways. One of you just said something about explaining to people what a record is. Just the concept of a record blows people's minds once they grasp that's a record. Yeah. And then you enter them into the matrix with, okay, but now we're going to link it to another record. And then you give them more of the matrix with, now we're going to allow that other record to fill in some fields on this record. You know, but real slow. you know, so many people don't
Progressive
understand how important it is to go slow. Yeah, what'd you say?
Progressive disclosure.
Yeah. And then the other thing that
slow, it's so important.
The other thing that I find that people struggle with is that they don't understand that you enter the data here, and then you have all these other views, all these other ways of looking at it, and it changes in all those other ways. If you change it in this view, then that new value is going to be when you change the view, it's going to change in the lookup, it's going to change in your page designer, that you only have to change it in that one spot. And that's another feature where it takes that database mindset to understand that.
Well, Airtable has the ability, though, I think, to release a product where the only view you have is grid, and any other view you do is built in a separate thing. I'm going to come back to, like, Airtable should just be the grid view, and any other view you make lives on a dashboard or some type of front end.
You know, that's Access. That's what Access did.
I'm 53. Come on. So, yeah, but like, it just would be easier for people. But the other problem with this, like, you know, Chuck was talking about some of these enterprise folks he was introducing this to, is like, I've run into this challenge where I show people Airtable and they get into it. And then as they show it to people, other people end up wanting the power. Okay, now I want my view and my apps. And you know what I mean? They want their own Airtable, right? And then it almost becomes this kind of hydra with like all these heads coming off of it. And you almost need, I really believe, the ability to hide Airtable features as you deploy it. Can you do that in any way? Can you hide the apps other than just not being a pro member?
Oh, even if you're not pro, you still see them, you just can't use them. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you take one that has it and move it into a free workspace.
A workspace per base.
Yeah. But you guys, Chuck, do you know what I mean? Or Kamille or Ben? I mean, you guys all deal with customers. I want to hide the other features until people understand them better. I think, am I asking for like something weird?
You can't control someone else's user interface. So they have their own Airtable account. And so you can't go in and basically say the automations button doesn't exist for you. What I can see.
But if I'm sharing my base with someone, could I do that?
What I was saying is, I think what they might eventually do is set up base permissions where, you know, the button will still be there, but you know, everything will be grayed out. Yeah. So you can't change any settings per se, but okay. I don't imagine they would hide necessarily the button to get into apps or the button to get into automation.
This is something you guys have complained about for a long time, that, you know, if you give somebody access to a base, they start doing things, and you'd really like them to be able to, please don't touch this just because you're an editor. Don't do these other things.
Yes. I feel like Ben probably will be gray soon because of that and all of his clients.
They have messed some things up. I think the only thing we have right now are locked views. Like, that's like, if you lock a view, then people can't access that really. But that's the extent of it. There's no like real feature hiding.
Yeah. And for apps, it's on a per app basis. So whoever or whichever team developed each app can determine how it handles permissioning. From a general perspective, regardless of what the app itself does, if the user doesn't have permissions in a particular table or if a particular record to edit any content within that record, the user can't do it. But it is possible to code into the app itself and say, only if your user ID is X, then you can do Y. That's a thing that's possible, but you'd have to do it for each and every app, and they're not going to do that.
Do you guys distribute bases where every view is locked?
I don't build bases for other people, specifically for this group. I'm apps all the way.
That was the closest to a mic drop we'll get, other than I have Airtable socks. I'm just going to let that be there. And Ben knows why it's some mic drop. It's like, Ben's like, or Camille's like, I don't build bases for other people.
It occurred to me that it's not the type of consulting that I want to do. It's why I answer a lot of questions.
I know Ben does all the time. Like, I know it's good, and I know you can be a 9-figure consultant like Gareth, but do not go down that road. It leads to the dark side.
Yeah, I will answer questions about, you know, hey, if I want to link records together, how would you do that? And I would just write instructions, but I don't want to set up a base, because then you would have to, put all the things in the right spot and then tell people, okay, now this is what you don't want to edit. But if you make them build it themselves, they know what they're doing because they built it themselves. Teach them and fish.
I think
Well,
that's
Ben, you've been really quiet.
No, it's been good listening.
All right.
Good.
Well, I guess that's all I had. I don't know. Kamille, it was good seeing you. It was nice seeing you online today. Chuck, always good to see you, brother.
I learned some stuff tonight. Good stuff.
I feel like we might have been a cube near each other at one point in the 90s.
I was in enough cities, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was good to see all of you. And I learned quite a bit today as well about all the new features coming out. So thank you. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for watching. And we will see you next week on Off the Record at 7 p.m.